When examining polygonal structures, the first question that always arises is, how much does their current appearance correspond to the original? What has been destroyed, and what has been restored? What has been added? What has been altered? What has undergone renovation? This question is indeed very important. Every such event changes the external appearance of the structure, and sometimes even details of its construction to some extent. This happened, for example, with many polygonal structures that were repurposed by the Spanish for churches and cathedrals. But at the same time, important details that could provide insight into the original purpose of the structure, why it was built in the first place, may be altered or even lost. Still, these structures were relatively fortunate. They have largely survived, preserved as foundations and base structures for Spanish buildings. This transformation effectively sealed them in place. The situation is far worse for polygonal structures that ended up being used as quarries. Quarries, here is not just a figure of speech but a factual statement. Structures were dismantled, and their blocks were used for constructing houses, barracks, temples, and even for road repairs. Stone extraction was carried out professionally by entire work crews. Blocks of suitable shape were used immediately. Irregularly shaped blocks were further processed on site. Entire layers of stone fragments bearing chisel marks have been preserved in Sacsayhuaman. This is how the entire Spanish city of Cusco was built, as documented in detail in historical chronicles of the time. Alongside the teams extracting building stones, treasure hunters were also at work. They too broke into and dismantled masonry, leaving behind ruins. Polygonal structures were also deliberately destroyed under the pretext of eradicating idolatry and resistance to Spanish rule. This was an entirely legalized process. In 1559, the Church Council of Cusco ordered that stones from Sacsayhuaman be used for the construction of the cathedral. As a result, what we see today in Sacsayhuaman is only about 40% of the original structures. The situation became so serious that the vice-governor of Cusco was forced to issue a decree prohibiting the use of stones from Sacsayhuaman under threat of a fine of 100 gold pesos. But even this did not help. The issue had to be addressed by both the Spanish crown and the viceroy. Relevant decrees were issued, but they had little effect. The Church Council of Cusco continued issuing permits for using excavated stones in the construction of churches and monasteries, canals, bridges, private houses, and for reinforcing riverbanks. But even before the Spanish arrived, polygonal structures attracted attention. Many specialists point out that the polygonal style and technology appeared suddenly, without evidence of gradual evolution. And it would indeed be strange to expect that the knowledge and skills required to work with granite, limestone megaliths, and andesite could have evolved from experience with clay, wood, or unworked stone masonry using mortar. These are fundamentally different technologies. Acquiring the skills necessary for constructing polygonal structures would have required a significant period of time. Experience and practice in creating something similar would have been essential. However, there are no signs of the evolution of this style or technology. It appears and disappears within a very short historical timeframe. By historical standards, it is sudden, as if it had been developed elsewhere and was then transferred here in a fully formed state, along with all the necessary knowledge, skills, and tools. The indigenous people readily adapted such structures for their own needs. Often, they followed the same approach as the Spanish, keeping the polygonal structure as a foundation and adding extensions using more accessible and easier to handle materials, such as unworked stone. They reinforced collapsed sections, increased the height slightly, and always added a gable for a roof. They also repurposed individual polygonal blocks that were no longer in use, incorporating them into masonry. There are no signs of systematic stone extraction from these structures. On the contrary, they tried to make the most of what they inherited. This was also practical. Those accustomed to building with unworked stone and mortar would not have been able to achieve qualities superior to polygonal masonry. At the same time, credit must be given to the indigenous builders. The scale of their modifications and additions is sometimes just as impressive as the polygonal structures themselves. Their completion required immense human and material resources, as well as considerable knowledge. This is especially evident in the construction of agricultural terraces. Pisac, Machu Picchu, and Ollantaytambo provide striking examples of what could be achieved using the META system, rotating labor brigades. However, attempts to adapt authentic polygonal structures to meet the immediate needs of the indigenous people or the Spanish often look crude and inadequate. Against the backdrop of polygonal masonry, extensions made of small, unworked stones with mortar, or without it, stand out in stark contrast. They clearly illustrate the construction capabilities and technological level of those who carried out the alterations. Individual polygonal blocks incorporated into rough stone masonry sharply contrast with their surroundings. And structural details of polygonal buildings, such as niches and specific configurations, either remain completely out of place or are used in whatever way seems practical to those now in control of the site. Sometimes, changes to the appearance of an object come from unexpected directions. For example, in Ollantaytambo, old photographs show that there were steps in front of the gate to the right of the Temple of the 10 Niches. They were rather crude, seemingly out of place, and did not harmonize well with the polygonal blocks. But regardless of their origin, the important point is that they were present in those photographs. Now, however, they are gone. Only behind the gate do they reappear, leading somewhere upward. In this image, everything has been cleared, down to the very blocks that form the foundation of the gate. Protrusions remain on the side blocks, clearly indicating where the actual threshold level should be. Now, everything is clean and ready to welcome tourists. However, in this case, the restoration team that worked so diligently deserves some thanks. The foundation masonry was exposed, revealing that even these blocks are not tightly joined. They were laid following the principle of double-row masonry, with the space between them filled with soil. And this is undoubtedly a technological aspect. When double-row masonry is created using small blocks, it might still be possible to find some simple explanations. But when the same principle is applied to the placement of megaliths, simple explanations no longer suffice. Only one conclusion comes to mind. The soil infill was meant to separate the blocks, preventing them from touching. By the way, these blocks are exactly the same as those lying above, near the 6 stones. The same material, the same size, a similar shape. And by all these parameters, they differ from those that make up both the gate itself and the wall. These are blocks from a dismantled, original structure that once stood where the 6 stones are now located. Thus, we have an unambiguous clue that the section with the gate was built after the megalithic structure above had been dismantled. This section was created using the same method of reusing blocks as the 6 stones and the horizontal masonry in front of them. The same technology was applied. This image also reveals some additional details. For example, the upper blocks of the gate have been shifted forward. And in this image, we can see the reason for the shift. One of the long blocks slid down the slope and landed directly in the gate opening. It now lies on the hill to the left. The possibility that the lintel block may have shifted out of place and collapsed as a result of this event seems quite likely. When it fell, the lintel may have also damaged the steps if they were made from solid blocks. Later, they could have been replaced with fragments of authentic blocks or with other stones that matched in size and shape. The result was somewhat unsightly, so the restorers may have decided that these stones spoiled the view and removed them entirely. The photographs also provide an idea of what other parts of this complex looked like at the beginning of the last century. Most of the facing on the lower platform had collapsed. It is clear that the platform itself was also damaged, revealing what it was made of and how it was constructed. Large boulders protrude from the slope, mixed with smaller stones and soil. To the right, on the Incan terraces made of unworked stone, piles of prepared stone pyramids can be seen. Some minor changes can also be observed near the 6 stones. Overall, the restorers deserve credit. Many elements remain in their original places. The only change is the position of the long blocks in front of the megaliths. They were joined together into a single structure, perhaps because someone else also considered that they might have been intended to align the upper boundary of the structure. The open space at the base of the megaliths was not immediately filled with broken stone but gradually over time. From this, it can be concluded that these stones serve a decorative purpose, covering the gaps rather than acting as structural supports. As a result, the front parts of the megaliths appear to be in a suspended state. They stand upright because, leaning slightly backward, they rest on the embankment with their lower rear sections. However, it is still impossible to determine what lies beneath them and what they are standing on, whether it is a rock foundation or soil. But it is unlikely to be soil, as they have remained in this position for a very long time and, judging by all indications, will continue to stand for a long time. The photographs also show what the polygonal complex in Pisac looked like at the beginning of the last century. The destruction here is uneven. It is unlikely to be the result of an earthquake. Some sections of masonry are missing a few rows, while others have been destroyed to the foundation. It is evident that many blocks are missing. It looks more like the structure was either being modified or was in the process of being expanded. Or, even more likely, this site also served as a quarry, from which local residents took blocks for their needs. There are also elements that the restorers clearly added based on their own interpretations of such structures, blocks with circular bosses. And this is small Kenko. Few people recognize this place at first glance. It looks too barren here. And it's not just because eucalyptus trees have now grown there. Much of what is now visible and open to view was once securely hidden underground. And that turned out to be a good thing. The masonry and structural details were surprisingly well preserved. As a result of restorations, only the details of the two-row masonry were inevitably concealed. Now it is impossible to examine the state of the rear sections and the backfill between the rows. This is Coricancha. Here it is before the earthquake of 1950. And here it is after the earthquake. The section on the right, made of regularly shaped blocks, remained standing. It is clearly visible that all the adjoining parts of the cathedral, built with mortar using polygonal blocks of secondary use, were damaged. The same is true for the interior. Before the earthquake. After it. And here are recent photos. On the newly made blocks, you can see traces of a bush hammer, a tool for working stone. This was used by restorers when reconstructing the site after the earthquake. However, proponents of the softened material theories interpret such marks as imprints from woven mats. And this is what the original block surfaces look like. There are not that many newly made blocks. And on some restored sections, to avoid confusion, the year of restoration is even marked, 1980. Tombeau-Maché. This is the beginning of the last century. And this is the end of it. In between, it looked like this. The general appearance of the structure and many interesting details have been preserved. Machu Picchu. In the oldest photographs, this complex appears as a completely forgotten and abandoned place. It's evident that the vegetation here had long gone unchecked. It is also clear that the structures of this complex did not particularly suit the indigenous people. They had to add a great deal, building as best they could, according to their immediate needs. Roof gables were added. In some places, the walls were extended, again using unworked stone. They certainly put in an enormous amount of work, but against the backdrop of the polygonal masonry, it looks rather rough and primitive. What is also striking is their persistent attempt to copy certain structural features. Trapezoidal openings and niches regularly appear in indigenous constructions, but in many cases, only approximately, without maintaining alignment within a single row, and without leveling the top edges. Most importantly, the walls in their constructions, especially those built without foundations on the remnants of polygonal structures, often lack the same inward slope as the polygonal buildings. Their structures do not follow a trapezoidal configuration. Pure cargo cult. The photographs also reveal some aspects of the site's restoration and clearing efforts. The main temple. The opening in the tower had been sealed. It was later uncovered. A remarkable shot of the Temple of the Three Windows. And here it is after restoration work. The masonry was slightly adjusted. An important component was added, without which people can hardly imagine architecture, a roof. Tourists found it more convenient, now there was a place to rest. But the structure itself did not benefit from this. The addition of rough stone construction had already significantly altered its appearance, and the thatched roof completed this transformation entirely. If all these unnatural additions were removed, it would become clear that this is yet another structure of the chair configuration. Smaller in size but still absolutely related to the main temple. So much so that, without close examination, they could be mistaken for one another. Upon closer inspection, however, it is clear that their masonry is different. The blocks of the main temple are identical to those of the tower. In the main temple, the foundation is partially made of megaliths, closely resembling a rock-cut base in principle. The structure near the tower, however, is made entirely of smaller blocks, with irregularly shaped stones in the foundation of the back wall, and mostly small stones above. In terms of construction style, this structure closely resembles those on the other side of the tower. It was clearly built after the tower. In other words, it was part of the second phase of construction. Thus, there are at least 3 such structures in the complex. The main temple, the Temple of the Three Windows, and this one near the tower, now disguised as a tourist rest area. The Machu Picchu complex is a strange place. 3 large configurations, each with features suggesting either specialization or some form of tuning. The Intihuatana stones. The tower. The open inclined plane, conventionally called the mirror. The cascade of fountains. And many other elements that are difficult, if not impossible, to relate to human needs, particularly those of the indigenous people. And if one mentally removes the additions and buildings introduced by them, something even more unusual emerges. Something extraordinary and undeniably technological.